Hilchis Mikvaos Perik Shishi. Kol HaKelim HaMekablim Sheholchu HaMayim Aleim Eshenoflu Meteichom is Harei Elu Shuvim Upesnus HaMikvah V'hu Sheyasu LeKabbalah. So there has to be a t'nai that this keli has to be a keli that's osu LeKabbalah. Afilo hayu kelim she'ein mekablim tumah kigen kli avonim kli hadam harei lo pesnus. It's not neged that the keli is a keli that's mekabel tumah. The ikah is that it's a keli that's a mekabel, and that it was osu LeKabbalah. Now the Lashon HaRambam first akelim ha-mekablim sheholchu hamayim aleim eishen noflu miteicham. Now noflu miteicham is l'chura pashut. It means that there was a keli there. And even though lepel, you didn't pour the water out of the keli. Lepel, the water came into the keli. Like we had the case before you, let's say shachach tachas hatziner, and then the water came into the keli. So that water has a din of mayim shuvim. And even let's say the keli broke, and then the water fell from the keli into the mikvah. But nevertheless, since that water was in the keli, so it has a din of mayim shuvim. Hol chol mayim aleim also maybe means that in other words, you didn't actually pour it. It went over the keli, and then from the keli, it went into the mikveh. That's how the Rambam teaches. You could also teach that Shehol Chamayim Aleim means that it didn't actually go into the keli. In other words, it flowed over the keli. It was the keli HaMekabel, and it flowed over the keli. Let's say the keli was full, so it was flowing over the keli HaMekabel. Didn't actually go into the keli, but from Desveng, nevertheless, it's considered that the keli became, the water became mayim shuvim. Let's read again. Kol HaKelim HaMekablim Sheholchu HaMayim Aleim, that's one scenario. Shenoflu miteicham, or the water was nofel from this keli HaMekabel. So the din is Harei Elu Shuvim. Again, the Rambam Aruch teaches, like both of them that were in the keli. The first case was, it was going from the tzinner into the keli, and from the keli into the mikvah, and then it was going from the sinner into the keli, and then the keli broke, and then it went into the mikvah. I'm not sure what would be the difference. Is harei l'shuvim, that both have a din of a shuvim. Well, pesel is a mikvah, abevahu, the t'nai is that the keli ha-mekabel should be yiyosu l'kabbalah. Then he says, afilo yekelim shei mekabel tumah ken klei avonim klei adoma, so it doesn't have to be a keli which is mekabel tumah. It has to be only a keli which is a mekabel and osu l'kabbalah, is harei elu pesel. Halacha base. Kol keli shelei nasa lekabel, a keli that was lei nasa lekabel, afal pishu mekabel, even though the pale it is a mekabel, any pesel is a mikvah kigein hasilenes, which are pipes, shamayim nimshachim, in which the water goes through the pipe. So a regular pipe is not a mekabel because the water just goes through. But over here says afal pishem rechavim be'amsa. There's an area in the pipe which is wider than the rest of the pipe, so therefore that area is a mekabel or mekablim. But nevertheless, ain't pesel is a mikvah. And the reason for it is because it was linasa lekabbalah. Is nachamol in order for the water that was in the mikvah, that was in the keli, or was holchu hamayim aleim to be pesel a mikvah, it has to be a keli which is a makabel, and it was nasa lekabbalah. But it's not neged that the keli was a keli that was makabel tumah. Halacha gimel hashoikas shebesela. Hashoikas is a trough which is in a cellar, which is in a rock, which the rock is mechatchila naturally mechubal lekarka. So the din is einei poiselis hamikvah, it doesn't pass the mikvah. The fish einei keli. In other words, when you hollow out something in something which is mechubal lekarka, so then it's not considered a keli. And be'emes, even if it became mechubal lekarka, as we'll learn mehamshach. In other words, something that you made into a keli while it was mechubal lekarka, it was naturally mechubal lekarka, or even if it later became mechubal. In other words, first it was detached from the karka, and then you connected it to the karka, and then you hollowed out a keli into it. Either way, it doesn't have a din of a keli. The sheikus, even though it's a makabel, but it doesn't have a din of a keli because it became a keli while it was attached to the ground. Aval keli shechibri besela. If you have a keli which is detached from the ground and is a keli already, and then you connected it to a cellar, to a rock, you connected it to something which is mechubal lekarka, so then pesel is hamikvah. So that does have a din of a keli, and water that goes into that keli becomes mayim shuvim. Aval b'shechibri besid. Even though after it became a keli, you connected to the karka with a very strong connection with cement, but nevertheless, since it was a keli, it didn't lose its shem keli by becoming mechubal lekarka. Now nikva milmata im natzad kishviferes haned. If this keli got a hole in it, so the mele it also lost its din, its din keli. In other words, it got a hole in it, so it didn't mamish lose its din keli. Because b'chlal, if you have a keli, even if the keli gets a hole in it, and lepel it's no longer makabel tumah, but still it has a din of a keli, as we'll learn b'hemshech, in order to make it into ma'im shuvim. In order for something to lose its din of ma'im shuvim, it has to be that the keli, first of all, lost its din. It was no longer a makabel. It has a hole, and also it was connected to the ground. Over here we're talking about that you connected to the ground. A keli that you connected to the ground is nikva milmata. If this keli had a hole in it, eimin atzad kishveferes haneid, is then it's ksheira, then the water that goes into that keli, which is connected to the ground, and it has a hole, either milmata or kishveferes haneid min atzad is ksheira, and ve'ene pisel samif. Halacha dalet. Halakeach keli godel, kigein chovis gdela, yareva gdela, and v'nikvei nekev hamatari. So that's number one. You made it into a nekev, you put a hole on it, which is big enough in order for this keli no longer to be makabel tumah. And v'kavi ba'aretz, and you connected it to the ground. V'aso mikvar is a kosher. And it becomes a kosher mikvah because it's not a keli. It's not a keli, it's mechubel karka. In other words, it lost, since it was nitar from being a keli before it became mechubel karka, and now it's mechubel karka. So just like we had before Negea, the seller, the shekish of a seller doesn't have a din of a keli. So this also, since it has a hole in it, and it was mechubel karka, so therefore it's kosher. V'chein, in pokak es hanekev besid u bebinyan. Normally I would touch pokak es hanekev besid, and you connected it to a binyan. You connected it to a billion, not to the karka. Before he was talking about kavi ba'aretz, now he's talking about ubebinyan. But the taish is brought down from Mishnayos that the pshat is that the kak wasn't made through sid alone. It was made also ubebinyan, which the taish means tzreiris ktanis, small pebbles. So it's like it's being built into the binyan. I'm not 100% sure. That seems to be that pakak esanekev. You have this chavis gdela, and you stuff the hole, the sid, with lime, and also ubebinyan. Bebinyan means tzreiris, things that you use for building purposes. So then that also has a din as if it's mechubel lekarka, and therefore any pesel. So that water that's in that chavis gdela, which had a nekev, which was matare, and then you was sosmei besidu bebinyan, so then it's any pesel. Before it was talking about that you were kavi ba'aretz, vasi mikvah. Now we're talking about nokve besidu bebinyan any pesel. And nachmer v'amayim hanikvah meteche, even though the it's not attached to the ground, it's a chiddush. V'amayim hanikvah meteche is mikvah kosher. That's talking about of sosmei besidu bebinyan. However, sosmei besid a begifsis, you only stuffed it with sid or gifsis, is hadayin hu pesel is hamikvah, achik be'enu ba'aretz a yivna. So you have to attach it to the ground. In other words, just closing that wouldn't be considered that it's attached to the ground. There's einochinami l'chur, it's not makabel tum anymore. But on the other hand, it has to be, in order for it to lose its din of a keli, it's not enough that it had a hole in it, but it has to be that it had a hole in it, and also yikvanu ba'aretz. B'negei sidu b'binyan, there's a special din that it has a din as if it was attached to the ground. I don't have it clear, but that seems to be besidu b'binyan seems to have a din that it's attached to the ground. Masha'inkin, if it's besid, a begifsis, so it's not attached to the ground. So in order for it to lose this din of being a keli, it has to be yikva'enu ba'aretz, a yivna also to build around it, which means to build around it and thereby put it connected to the ground. That's v'im helichi al gabi ha'aretz v'al gabi hasid. In other words, if you schlepped it on the ground and on top of the sid, so that's how it became connected to the ground. And you smeared it from the sides, and you also smeared it with sid, is then a kosher. The nekuda is that we said before that if you take a keli, and that keli had a hole, and then you connected it to the ground, so then it becomes uis din keli, which pesels a mikveh, and nochmer, it has a din of a mikveh mamish. Now there was another din that even if it had a hole and you stuffed that hole with sid or bebinyan, so also a person loses its din of keli, and it also has a din of a mikvah. Now we're saying that if you have a hole and mirche besid begifsis, so it doesn't lose its din of a keli, and still it passels the water of the mikvah. The water that goes in there, it becomes passel. However, if you took this keli and you were hilichi, you have a keli that has a hole in it, and you schlep it on the ground, so that's how you're connecting it to the ground. You're connecting it. Before you connected it besit. Over here, you're connecting it by schlepping it on the ground, and that's how you're stuffing the hole, and it's al gabi sit, al gabi oris, al gabi sit. So Mele, that's causing it to become connected to the ground, and you're being mirchei minatzad, so it had a hole in it, and you connected it to the ground, and therefore it's kosher. Halacha hey, haminiach tavlo tachas hatziner, v'harei hamayim nimshochem al tavlo, v'yerdim lemikva. So you have a tavla. A tavla is a tray, and that tavla is under the pipe, and the water is going onto the tray and going from the tray into the mikvah. Now, if this tray had a wall around it, so maybe the tray has a din of a keli which is mekabel. Says arezu piselis mikvah. That's what we learned before. That the kelim hamekablim shaholchu hamayim aleim. This would be a case. Holchu hamayim aleim is piselis mikvah. But if the tavla has no tray, so even though the tavla has a purpose to be mekabel, but never to function, but nevertheless it's not a keli hamekabel, and therefore any piselis. Now this is talking about when you spread out the tavla on the bottom. So melis, it's in a position where the tavla could be a makabel. However, zokva tachas atziner, and the purpose of zokva is kedei lahadicha. Whereas there's two in yonim. Sai, you put it up, in an upright position. So memela, it's not shaykhs to be makabel, and the reason why you did it was kedei lahadicha, in order to wash the tavla. Is afal pishiyesh lo defen, is eine piselis shareli asa lekabel, because you didn't put it in that position in order lekabel, because since it's an upright position, so that you didn't put it in that position lekabel. So it's brought down that, because he's saying two in yanim. First of all, it has to be that zok v'tachas hatziner. In other words, if it would be l'moshel, you'd put it under the tziner. It's not clear, but look, there's some medayik that if you put it under the tziner, not biskifa. So even though you put it under the tziner in order kedei lahadicha, so that wouldn't be that the water would still be puzzled. It has to be two things letevusa. But sai was zokfa and sai kedei lahadicha. So b'cheifen kazeh, it's not pesel samif. Halacha vov. Hachoitet betziner mokim lekabel behatzreides hamizgalgalim b'mayim. You have a pipe, and the water is going through the pipe, and there's little pebbles that are coming along with the water, and you want those pebbles not to go along with the water and not to come out with the water through the pipe. So you have a little hole that you made you hollowed out a little hole in this pipe, in order that the pebbles, when the water flows, the pebbles should fall into that hole, into the hole in the pipe. In other words, it's an indentation in the pipe, in the inside of the pipe. Hachoited betziner mokim lekabel beatzreides hamizgalgalim b'mayim kidei shaliyerdim amayim. Your purpose is that those pebbles shouldn't go down together with the water. Is im hoya atziner shalates, and the chafer bekolshu, as long as you made any makabel, because by a eitz, the din of an eitz being a makabel, there's no shear, is pesel. So then this pipe passes the water that goes through this pipe, because lepel, it's going through a clay, a keli, which is a clay kibble and osil kabbalah. Sharikol amayim sheyerdim boim mitech keli shenasel kabbalah. All the water is going through the pipe, so maybe it goes through that area where it has the kli kabbalah. Again, we're not saying not necessarily the water goes into that clay kibble; it's going over the clay kibble. But I'll call upon kol amayim yerdim boris mitech keli shenasel kabbalah. That's din. Even though this pipe is already mechuber lekarka, but it's talking about you first made this indentation in the pipe, you hollowed out this area in the pipe, and then you took the pipe and you connected it to the ground. So we said before that if it was a keli and then you connected it to the ground, it still has it in keli. So this pipe has a din of a tolush. If first you connected the pipe to the ground, and then after the pipe was already connected to the ground, you hollowed out a place for a base kibble, in a place like we learned before, b'negei the cellar, that if you connected it to the cellar, and then you made it into a keli, so it's not a keli. That's talking about if it's a tziner shel eitz, so then there's no shear of how much it has to be hollowed out, even a kol shul. However, the imhoyet tziner shel cheres, so in order for a cheres to have a din of a klei kubel, ein a pesel, so it has to be that is the what you hollowed out in the pipe, which is a pipe of cheres, has to be at least big enough to be mekabel l'vis. That's the din. So the din is that if you have this pipe that has this chak and the water goes through it, so that water becomes water that's mayim shuvim because it went through water, it went through a keli that was osir l'kabbalah. Now, aval pishin esmali amokim achokik shebetziner tzreiris hamischalchel b'seichei. In other words, even if that area in the pipe, which was the indentation in the pipe, became full of pebbles, so l'chura the water is not really going in there, but nevertheless, since the pebbles are mischalchel b'teichei, which means it's loose, it's not tight, so therefore the water could still go down into those pebbles because lepel, the water could go through those pebbles. So therefore it has a din that the water becomes water that becomes mayim shuvim. Harehu b'pesulei. And ve'eni kisosim, it's still that this keli is still considered a keli posel. Ve'eni kisosim, it's not like you closed up that area of the clay kibble because lepel, even though there's pebbles there, but the water can still go in there. Yorad l'techamokim shechokak offer etzreiris v'sosmi v'nichmash. In that area where you hollowed out earth or stones came in there, and over there it became tightly packed, and it closed up the area. So now water can't really enter into that area. So then it is a kosher. Then the water that goes over through this pipe is kosher because lepel at Einachinami the pipe was once royal kabbalah, but now it's not any royal kabbalah because that area was stuffed up. Halacha zayin hasvoig, if you have a sponge, or v'hadli, or if you have a pail, shahayibem shleisha lugim mayim, they had shleisha lugim mayim in this sponge or in this dli, and the Mefarshim explained that we're talking about a dli that has a very narrow top, a very narrow spout, because if we're talking about a dli that doesn't have a narrow spout, so the fact that the dli falls into the mikveh with shleisha lugim mayim shuvim is as if the water fell into the mikveh, because the pail, since it's a very open area, this pail, a regular pail with a full open top, so then it's as if the water fell in. Over here we're talking about that we're dealing with a pail, the Rambam doesn't say it, but that's how the Mefarshim explain, that we're dealing with a pail that has a very narrow top, and therefore the water that's in the pail is not really considered mu'uriv with the mikveh. They didn't fall into the mikveh. Nachamol. Hasveig v'adli shahayim b'm shleish lugamayim, and v'naflu mikveh, and they fell into the mikveh, either the sponge fell in or the dli fell in, is lei paslu, although in that sponge or in that dli there are 3 lugim of mayim, they don't pass the mikveh. Why? Shaliyamru el shleish lugim shenaflu. It has to be that the shleish lugim, the water was naflu. Le kli shenaflu be shenaflu be mayim shuvim. It's not a psakeli. It's a lashon. Le keli shenaflu be mayim shuvim. Not a keli that had mayim shuvim that fell in. It has to be the mayim shuvim fell in. And over here the sfeik fell in, or al der zeh the pail fell in, but not the water itself. Halacha ches. Hashida v'ateva shebiyam. There is a box in the yam, and that box is attached to, there's an attachment to the water which is in the yam. There's an attachment to the water that's in the yam. Ein madbilum bem. Elim kein hoyu nekuvim kishviferes hanet. Since it's a separate entity, it's a box, even though it's in the yam, but it's a box. So therefore, in order for the water in this shida teva to be considered attached to the water in the yam, it be considered mikvah water. So it is only if that water is kishveferes hanet. Imhoya sak a kupa, but if we're dealing not with a box, but rather with a sak, which is a sack that's made out of his goat's hair, or a kupa, which is a basket, which is very porous and has a lot of holes in it, and therefore it's like made out of different material like hay or reeds, but it's very porous. So then madbilim, because the water in that box is considered really water in the yam. And that din is saibin again we're talking about. So this din would be in both ways. Over here we're talking about being toivel in a shida and teva shebiyam, as opposed to being toivel in a sak or kupa shebiyam. The same din, v'chein haminiach sak e kupa tachas atziner. So we have a din that if you put something under a tziner, so it becomes mayim shuvim. You put a keli under a tziner, it becomes mayim shuvim. But if we're dealing with a keli that's a sak, which really can't contain the water because the water will go out right away from the sak. And al derazet, a kupa, which the water will again go out straight from the kupa from this keli. So therefore, is ein hamayim hanimshachim mihem Pesel Samikva, because it never had a din that it was a keli. So the Nekudas Advarim is the Legabi, these dinim that we're learning over here, Legabi Mayim Shuvim, which are Pesel Samikva, it has to be a keli which could contain water. So Ein Nachanami, even if the keli is no longer, it was nitar from being Mekabel Tumah, but on the other end, it has to be a keli that contains water. So if we're dealing with a shida and a teva, so it's a keli that contains water. Mashenk in a sack and a kupa can't contain water. So sai, in the yam, it could be a kosher mikveh without any special holes. And also, if water goes into it, it doesn't make it into mayim shuvim, which is peselis hamikveh. Halacha tes, gistra tmeya shehi b'techa mikveh, usvasa l'mayla mamay. Now we're talking about over here, you have a gistra means a broken keli. Now when you have a regular keli, if you put a regular keli that's tummy, for example, into the mikveh, so if the entire keli is immersed in the mikveh, so then the water that's in this keli, which is completely immersed in the mikveh, has a din of mikveh water, and anything that's in that keli also becomes tar. In other words, if a keli was in that keli, so it also becomes tar, like we learned before. That's talking about a regular keli. Now, if part of that keli is sticking out, so then basically the water that's in the keli is not the mikveh water because it's in a keli, and therefore that water obviously you're not going to become tar in that water. Mashenkin a gistra is talking about it doesn't have a straight top. It has like a rigid top. So you can have a gistra which is immersed in the mikveh, and part of those ridges, those pieces that are still on top, are still sticking out of the mikveh. But on the other hand, the water that's in the gistra is attached to the mikveh because lepel, since it's open on the bottom. So therefore, the water that's in the bottom of the gistra could be completely mikveh water, even though part of the gistra is sticking out of the water above the mikveh. So now if you're going to take a keli and you're going to put it into the mikveh, which is into the gistra, which is in the mikveh, so when that keli goes into that gistra, which basically means into that water, which is mikveh water, so the keli becomes tar because the keli was tavel. Now when you take the keli out of the water, so the keli was tar. The problem is that the din is that a gistra, and there was a kli cheres noch mekabel ma'aver. And we have a gistra, so the aver of the gistra is you reckon also in that rigid, those parts, even though it's not a completely top, but it has little pieces on top of it. So anything that's within the airspace of those little pieces is also mekabel tumah als tumas aver. It's tumas aver, the klicheres is metamim aver. So mele, when this keli that was tovel in this gistra, which was completely immersed in the mikveh water, which was in the gistra, starts coming out of the water, so the keli is not going to become tummy from the aver of the gistra, because the aver of a gistra can't make a keli tummy. Aver gistra has a din of a klicheres, which is a rishon l'tumah, and can't be matame a keli. But it could be matame the water that's on the keli. So now you have that water starting to stick out of that keli, which was tovel in the gistra, starts sticking out from the water. So that keli now is in the aver of those pieces of the gistra. Now the keli is not a problem, but the water that's on the keli is a problem. That water is mekabel tumah, and that water is going to be rimatame, the keli, which is now coming out of the mixer. So you were toivel this keli in the gistra, so the tefillah was a good tefillah. You took the keli out of the water, so the keli should be tar, but the problem is the water that's on the keli becomes tummy, and that water that's on the keli is matame the keli which is coming out. That's the din. Nachamo. Gistra tmei, you have a gistra tmei she betecha mikvah. Usvasa and the edges on top of the gistra is l'maylam na mikvah. And as we say, it's not a complete. It would be complete, so the water in the gistra wouldn't be mikvah water. But since it's a gistra, so the water in the gistra is mikvah water, and the svasa of the gistra is sticking out, piece of that svasa. Now v'hitbul bo kelim, and you would tevel kelim in the gistra, so the din is taru mitumasim, so the kelim become tar, because lepel you would tevel it in the mikvah. Aval kshiagbiyim min hamayim ache. When you pick it up out of the water, is achehein ba'aver hagistra, while they're in the aver hagistra, is mistame hamayim shal gabam me'aver hagistra. So then the water which is on this keli, which you're taking out of the mikvah, is becoming tummy from the aver hagistra, and once that water becomes tummy, is v'chayzer metamesim. So that keli also becomes tummy. That keli also becomes tummy. You have to tzarech a little. We learned that Kasamish is medayik from the Rambam, that the tefillah happens not when something goes into the mikveh, but when something comes out of the mikveh. So over here, when this keli went into the mikveh, it wasn't really tar. The keli started becoming tar when it started going out of the mikveh. When it started going out of the mikveh, so as soon as it started going out of the mikveh, so the water became tamei, and the water was matame the keli. So it was really never a time that the keli was tar, because while it was in the water, l'chura it wasn't tar, as we say, because it only becomes tar when it comes out. And when it comes out, it became tamei through the water. And Lashon Haram is a little bit different. Lashon Haram is v'hitbul botelim is taru mitumasim. Lashon Haram sounds like it became tar while it was in the mikvah, and then aval kshiyagbiyah min hakeli min hamayim. So then it becomes tar. I don't know how this Rambam stems with the other Rambam that the Rambam says in Perek Tes and Tumas Mes that Gesamisha is medayik, that the tefillah that tefillah only helps when it comes out, not when it goes in. Okay. Then the Rambam continues so we see over here that the Kbiyah Echatim something was tevel, but on its way out it becomes tamei. V'chein yavet Echatim of a mayon hayoytze mitachas hatanur hatami. So you have a tamei dikatana which is covering the ground. And now in the floor of this tanur dikatame, there's a maya, there's a spring. Now v'yara, the person went into the tanur, and he went down into the spring, and he was tevel. V'yara v'tovel b'techi, he was tevel in this maya. So the din is who tar? He is tar, because lepel, a person doesn't become tamei from a tanur. A tanur is only a rishon l'tumah. So a person doesn't become tamei from aver tanur. However, v'yadav, but his hands, which is in the avaratana, so when he comes out of the mikveh, he's takator. But on the other end, his hands, which are now in the avaratana, is tmeis me avaratana, because that's the din that yodayim that finds itself in avar of a tanur tummy, it becomes tummy. Elim came. The only situation that the water, that the hands should be tar, is hoyu hamayim lemaila min hatanur kirum yodav. So, you have the water, the spring water is like going up, and it's actually covering the entire tanur. So you have a tanur tamei, which is in like a full area of water, of spring water, which is the spring water is coming up and covering the tanur, actually covering the tanur. And not only covering the tanur, it's covering the tanur that all the entire hand, when you come out of the tanur, so your entire hand is covered with this spring water. Shenimtza, so it comes out, kshetava, when a person was tevel, so now, and he's coming out of the water, so the lepeil, yodav l'mayla manataner, the yodav, the lashon is not so clear, this lashon kshetava, yodav l'mayla manataner, the nekuda is that the yadayim are under the water of the tefillah while you're l'mayla manataner. She'en kli cheres mistanen b'mikveh k'mei shebiyanu. So in other words, b'kitzer, you have a tanner, and under the tanner there's a spring, and you go into the spring, which is in the tanner, you come out of the spring, you're tar, but your hands are tummy. Now what happens if the spring completely covered the tanner? So let's say if it would have completely covered the tanner till the very top. So you're in the water, you're becoming tar. You come out of the water, you're also becoming tar. But you're tar when you come out of the water. The problem is your hands are in the tanner. Now, while your hands are in the tanner, which is immersed in water, that's not a problem, because those hands aren't going to become tummy while the water is completely covering the tanner. Masha'enken, when your hands start coming out of that water, so part of your hands are still in the tanner. Part of your hands are still in the tanner, and part of your hands are above the tanner. Now, the hand that's in the tanner, so if the hand would be completely immersed, this is the Rosh's masber. If the hand would be completely immersed in the tanner, so there would be no problem. But since lapel, part of your hand is still in the tanner, and part of your hand is out of the tanner, so therefore the hand, even the part that's in the tanner, becomes tummy. A hand that's in the tanner, that's completely immersed in water, wouldn't become tummy. But a hand that's immersed, that's partially in a tanner, that's immersed in water, and partially it's above the tanner, so the hand is not completely immersed in water, and part of the hand is in the water which is in the tanner, so that hand becomes tummy. No, a hand becomes tummy from the tanner. It doesn't have to be the whole hand in the tanner, even if part of the hand is in the tanner. Now, if the entire tanner is filled with water and the hand is in that tanner, in the water, it doesn't become tummy. That's what the Rosh says. It doesn't become tummy. But if you have a tanner which is completely immersed in water, and part of that hand is in the tanner, so then the entire hand becomes tummy. The part of the hand that's above the tanner is not becoming tummy because it's above the tanner. It's not in the tanner. The part of the hand that's in the tanner, when part of the hand is above the tanner, so then that hand becomes tummy. Hope that's clear. So Memela, so in order for the person to have his hands tar, it's not enough that the entire tanner should be covered with water. Like the case by the gister. By the gister, it was a case, if the entire top of the gister would be covered by water, there would be no problem. Because lapel, while it's in the water, there's no problem. When it's out of the water, it's not out of the water. Whatever's out of the water is not becoming tummy because it's above the gister. Over here by the hand, you could be out of the water, part of the hand is out of the water, and still the hand is becoming tummy because there's part of the hand that's in the water. That part of the hand that's in the tanner. So therefore, you have to have that there should be enough water on top of the tanner that the entire hand, when it comes out of the tanner, is still completely immersed in water. So then the hand is going to be tar. That's the nekuda. So even though the tanner is completely submerged in the water, but nevertheless the tanner retains its din tumah. Halacha yud chavis malei mayim shenaflu liyam. Says the water from the chavis fell into the yam, but a large amount of water fell into the yam together. Afilu yam agadol, which a yam is a body of water which doesn't flow; it stands in one place. Is a table sham, someone that's table in that area where the chavis malei mayim fell in, is lay also le tefillah. The tefillah is not a good tefillah. Why? Because he afshel l'shleishis lugim shleiyil b'makom echad. Since in that area there must be shleishis lugim of mayim shuvim together, so therefore that water, since there's shleishis lugim of mayim shuvim together, so therefore it doesn't become part of the mikvah, whereas the yam itself is a mikvah. It would be a kosher mikvah, but since he afshel l'shleishis lugim shleiyil b'makom echad, so therefore that area where the water is not considered a water that became part of the mikvah. And therefore, the kika shel truma shenafal l'sham. So if a person went ahead and was tovel in this area, so since we're saying that tefillah wasn't a good tefillah because there's mayim shuvim there, so then fakir, so the water that's there became tummy. So Mamela, as a result of that, is kika shel truma shenafal l'sham became nitma b'mayim hashuvim. Shari hamayim ein them sham, and this person that was tummy was just there. So Mamela, the kikar also becomes tummy. So this is a din mechudesh because the shaila is lechura a chavis. I mean, the water came into the mikveh. Lechura we're talking about a kosher mikveh. So why shouldn't that water become mikveh water? Just like regular din, we have regular mikveh water, a regular mikveh, and you make hashaka with water that's not mikveh, so it all becomes tardika water. What kind of din is this that you have water that falls into the yamagod, a large amount of water, but nevertheless it doesn't become a din of a mikveh. Why? Because we're saying that there's shleish shalug and mayim shuvim which are standing in one place. There's a lot of diyunim and mefarshim and they get shot in this and they get to it's brought down in the Gemara. Marcus talks about it, but it's not so clear. The Rambam brings a Merkavas HaMishnah that says that the Rambam is speaking legabi truma. In other words, the person, like we say behemshach, kikol shetruma shenafel l'sham. So the point is that legabi truma, the tefillah needs kavana. When a person's tevel, in order to be Torah l'truma, so you need kavana for that tefillah. So he's saying, al derezeh, when you mashik mayim, when you connect water to a mikveh, and you want that water should be used for truma, in other words, you want to be tevel in that water for truma, so that also needs kavana for this hashaka, which is a davar mechudesh. And the mail over here, it's talking about that hatevel sham l'truma is also le tefillah. It's a davar chodesh to say that that's pshat in the Rambam, but it's not so clear the havana of the Rambam. Again, normal we neman that when water, any water that's mayim shuvim, kol meimah shebe'elam, that's connected to a mikveh, it becomes all mikveh water. Here we're saying that there's a chavis which is malei mayim that falls into the yam. So we're saying since in that area there's shleish shalugim of mayim shuvim, so therefore that area, when a person's table in that area at that point in time, right after it falls, so it's lay also a tefillah, and if a kikar of truma falls into that area, that kikar of truma becomes tummy. Again, it's something which tzarech bir. But that's all talking about, we're talking about the yam. So therefore it is a table sham, because the water flows, and the mela we assume that the original water is not the water that's there now. Halacha Yudalef. Mayim she'uvim shehoyu b'tzad mikveh. Now the tzir, as the Kas Mishnah explains, based on Mishnayos, that we're talking about mayim that's in a keli, and it's in a mikveh, but it's mechuber to the mikveh. You have a keli, which is mechuber to the mikveh, and it's in a keli, and it was on the side of the mikveh. It wasn't in the middle of the mikveh, it was on the side of the mikveh. And it's mechuber to the mikveh through the hole in the keli. Mayim she'uvim shehoyu b'tzad mikveh. Is afal pisha mayim noigim b'mei mikveh. So this water is touching the Mei HaMikveh, it's connected to the Mei HaMikveh, is leipaslu, mipnei shein kimikveh samach lemikveh. It doesn't have a din of mayim shuvim that fell into a mikveh. It's like a mikveh next to a mikveh. That's talking about if there was b'tzad a mikveh. Hoya shuvim be'emtza, but if the same scenario would be in the middle of the mikveh, not on the side of the mikveh, so then that would have a din of poistless a mikveh. That would have a din that it does pass the mikveh, because then it would have a din of mayim shuvim shenoflu l'teich mikveh. If it's on the side of the mikveh, so it's not. It's like mikveh b'tzad mikveh. Mashenkin, if it's in the middle of the mikveh, so then it has a din of mayim shleisha luga mayim shuvim that fell into the mikveh. You have to know. We learned earlier that there was a din of the sveg we had in halacha zayin of the sveg of the dli that fell into the mikveh. And we learned before that was talking about a dli that didn't have a large opening, and therefore this dli is not considered that it's shleisha lugim in the mikveh because it's in a keli. Over here, obviously, we have to be talking about it's a larger opening. It's a larger opening, and nevertheless, and it's also learning that it's connected to the mikveh. It's actually connected to the mikveh. So nevertheless, it depends if it's on the side, so it's considered a mikveh b'tzad mikveh. Masha'inkin, if it's in the middle, so then it's considered that it was naflu l'techa mikveh. Halacha yud beis. Shtei breches zu l'mayla mizu. You have two mikvehs, two pools of water. One is above the other, but it's not mamish above each other. In other words, it means they're on the side of each other, but one on one side is in a higher area, and the one on the other side is in a lower area. They're next to each other, side by side, but one is in a higher place and one is in a lower place. And the case will be named, there's a wall that divides them. V'halyena is malei mayim kshedim, it's mayim kshedim, which is mayim kshedim but it's not memsa. And v'atachtena malei mayim shuvim, and the one on the bottom has mayim shuvim. Now, v'nikav b'kaisel shebein halyena l'tachtena, and there's a nekav b'kaisel shebein halyena l'tachtena. Between the two mikvahs, there is a hole. Now, the question is, we're talking about a mikvah that doesn't have 40 saw, and there's a hole between the tachtena and the lyena. So the question is, if the water of the tachtena is going to passel the lyena, that's the nekud over here. If the water of the tachtena, which is mayim shuvim, is going to passel the water of the lyena, which is not mayim shuvim. So it's as im yesh keneged hanekev shleishes lugim mayim shuvim. If keneged the nekev, there's 3 lugim of mayim shuvim. So even though this is tachtena and this is lyena, so mele tachtena doesn't go so easy into the lyena. Whereas if it would be that the lyena is mayim shuvim, tachtena is not mayim shuvim, so then for sure this din would apply, because lepel, the water goes down. The water naturally goes down. But over here it's fakert. We're dealing that this isElyena and this is Tachtena. But nevertheless, if this Keneged HaNekev Shleishis Lugim Mayim Shuvim is NifsulElyena, so theElyena becomes possible. Why? Mipnei shehanekev ki'ilu be'emtzeElyena le betzida. We just learned that if you have Mayim Shuvim, which is B'tzad HaMikveh, so it doesn't pass. If it's Be'emtze HaMikveh, it does pass. So that was talking about it was a Keli that was B'tzad HaMikveh or Be'emtze HaMikveh. Over here, when you have these 2 mikvahs and then you have this nekev, you have the 2 brechos, you have the nekev. So since this nekev is ma'arev them, they're ma'arev the 2 mikvahs. So mele, the water which is connected on nekev has a din ki'ilu, it's b'teicha mikvah. And mele, since that mikvah is a mikvah that doesn't have arboim saw, and that water which is shleisha lugim is ki'ilu, it's b'teicha mikvah. So therefore it passes it. So again, yesh ben connected on nekev shleishis lugim ma'im shuvim nifsa halyenim b'nei shah nekev. Now, what does it mean? So the Rambam brings over here he says from Pirush HaMishnayos that Keneged HaNekev means that in the nekev, in other words, in the space of the nekev, in other words, the wall has a thickness. Obviously, the wall has a thickness. So in that area of the nekev, we're not talking about the water that's in the Breicha Tachtena, which has Mayim Shuvim. We're talking about in the nekev itself. That's how he's teaching Keneged HaNekev, that in the nekev itself there's 3 lugim of mayim shuvim. That's how big the thickness and the width and the height and the thickness of the nekev is, that it contains shleisha lugim. That's how he says pshat. And normally, if you read the Rambam l'chura be'efim poshut, it would be Keneged HaNekev means in the Breicha Tachtena. In other words, if you take a look at this Breicha Tachtena, you just see straight from this nekev till the end of the Breicha Tachtena, which is Keneged HaNekev. If there's shleishis lugim, that's l'chura how you would teach Keneged HaNekev. But he's saying no, the Keneged HaNekev means what's in the nekev, not Keneged HaNekev, but what's in the nekev. Okay. Then he says halacha yud gimel kama yir b'nekev v'yeh b'shleisha lugim. How big should the nekev be and be shleisha lugim? So he says, hakel lefi habrecha. It depends how big the brecha is, and that'll decide how big the nekev should be. Is azoy. Now the din is that a mikveh is the 40 saw. A 40 saw is the cheshbon. Let's make the cheshbon of 40 saw is every saw is 6 kav, and every kav is daled lugim. Every kav is daled lugim. So maybe it comes out a saw is be'emes 24 lugim. Every saw is 24 lugim. Now, since there's 40, if there's 40 saw in a mikveh, so 40 times 24, that's 960 lugim. 960 lugim. Now, 3 lugim to 960 lugim is 1 out of 320. There's 3 times 320 is 960. So 3 lugim to 960 lugim is a 320th. Is nachamo. Kama yeh b'nekev yeh b'shleish lugim hakil lefi habrecha. Now mhoisa brecha tachteina arboim saw. If the bottom brecha was 40 saw, is how big does the nekev have to be? Tzarech she'yeh nekev echad mishleish meiz v'esim lebrecha. So then the nekev has to be a 320th of the brecha. Now since the brecha contains 40 saw, so memela, so 40 saw is 960 lugim. Now we're talking about that it should be 3 lugim. So the nekev to be 3 lugim, it means it's 103. It's 1 out of 320 of the brecha. Now hoisa esim saw, if the whole bottom brecha was esim saw, so then so esim saw is the 20 times 24, 20 times 24. So then is sarach lies hanekev echad mimei v'shishim lebrecha. So then it has to be 1 out of 160. A half before we said. Double rather double in comparison to the ratio. The ratio before we said if it's 40 saw, so it's 1 out of 320, and if it's 20 saw, so then it's double of that, so it's 1 out of 160. Because he says the cheshbon shasor sheishes kabin, v'akav arba lugim, and it says here v'alug shisha beitzim, but they bring that it's not negay over here the girza, because over here we're not talking about the cheshbon. It's another piece of information. That I look at shisha beitzim, but it's not negay over here. What's negay over here is that I saw is shisha kabim, and a kav is arba lugim. Now the ma'isa is that l'chura, if we're talking about taka, how big the nekev is. In other words, we're talking about the water that's actually in the space of the nekev. So I don't understand really. So what are we gaining by knowing the dimensions of the brecha tachteina? In other words, say, how are you going to know if this nekev has 3 lugim in it? So you have to look to find out how much the brecha is, and then figure out the ratio of the brecha to the nekev. I mean, how do you know if the brecha has 40 lug, and how do you know if the brecha has 20 lug? So we really have the cheshbon already. We have the cheshbon because we learned that amma alama berum gimel amas is arboim lug. But if the point is you want to know how much space there is in this area which is in the hole, so l'chura, what's in the gear the size of the brecha? If you'd learned that the pshat is that you're talking about all the water which is in the brecha, connected of the hole, so it would be understandable. In other words, you have a brecha, and then you have part of that brecha is the connected the hole, so you can figure out what percentage of the brecha is connected the hole. You take a look at the wall. The wall, in other words, the height, let's say you take a look at the height and the width of the brecha, and now you see what ratio is that hole, legabi, that area. And then you'll know how much water is connected the hole. So that would be easier. In other words, if you know how big the brecha is, so then it would be simple to figure out how much is connected that brecha, connected that negative. But if the point is, like we said before, which L'churi brings from Pirush Mishnayos and Bartanura and others, that the point over here is that we want to know how much water is in the nekev itself. So I don't understand why is it negir to know how much water is in the brecha and what's the ratio between the nekev and the brecha. I mean, it seems to be making things more complicated. It'd be simpler to figure out the cheshbon, how big an area does it have to be in order for it to have gimel lugim, not to figure out how big it is l'gabi the brecha. Basically. Halacha Yudalit. Sholish mikvois ze b'tzad ze. You have 3 mikvois, one next to each other, and b'chol echad mem esim so mechavanis. Each one has exactly 20 so. And ve'echad mehem shov min hatzad. And one of them, and one of the outer ones, either the third or the first, not the middle, is shov. So you have two pools of water with kosher water, kosher mikvah, and then you have a pool of water of not kosher, if maim shuv. And that's Minatzad. Now v'yordu shleisha, v'tovlu b'shlashim. 3 people went into, each one went into a pool of water at the same time, and they're all being toivel together. They're all being toivel together. Now when they're being toivel, so the water that's in each mikveh is flowing over to the other mikveh. Because lepel, the water is very high, let's say, or maybe to the brim, and memela, when you're being toivel, so that water is flowing over. V'nermu hamayim mikulam v'nisarvu milmayla. And all of the water flowed over. In those, each one of the 3 mikvahs flowed over to each other. So the din is, ha-mikvois ksherim v'atevlim terim. Now the question is, Azay, mayim sh'uvim pasels a mikvah that has only 20 saw. So if we'll assume that the mayim sh'uvim touched, the first paseled one of those 2 mikvois that each one had 20 saw, so it's a pasel of mikvah. So in other words, this one of the mikvois became pasel. So mela, obviously, it's all pasel. So you don't have a kosher mikvah. Masha'engen, if we're going to assume that the 2 mikvois joined first, again, we have 1, 2, and 3. Let's say 1 and 2 are both kosher water. 20 saw each of kosher water. The third is mayim shuvim. So if we're going to assume that the third joined the second first, so the second became pasel because there's mayim shuvim in the second, and now so the second and the first can be a mikveh because the second is mayim shuvim. Masha'enken, if we're going to say fakir that the first and the second joined first, so mele it became arboim saw. Once it becomes arboim saw, so there's no problem of the third because the third can't pasel already the second because the second is part of the first and has arboim saw. So that's the chiddush. The chiddush over here we're saying is that we nem on that the first and the second became a kosher mikveh, and memela the third doesn't pasel. And the reason for it is because in order for it to become the first and the second to join, all they have to do is join together. There has to be ashaka as long as they join together on top. So as soon as they join together, it's considered a kosher mikveh. In order for the mayim shuvim to pasel the mikveh, it's not enough that they touched each other. It has to be that the mayim shuvim fell into the kosher mikveh. So basically, the 2 mikvois that are ksherim become united before the mikveh, which is pasel, passes. And therefore, and once they become united, so the mikveh that pasel, that could pasel, doesn't pasel. Let's read again, start again from the beginning. Shalish mikvoi zebet tzadzeh, and b'chol echad mem esim so michuvanis, and ve'echad mem shov min atzad, and the shov is on the third or the first. And now v'yordu shleisha v'tovlu shloshtem, and all of them 3 with table. And v'nermo hamayim mikulav min esarva milmayla, and the water overflowed from all the mikvois, and they touched each other from the top. So the din is ha-mikvois ksherim, the mikvois are ksherim. And v'hatevlim terim. Why? Sharinasa hakel shishim shah, because now we have all 3 mikvahs are 1 mikvah of shishim shah. Mehem arboim ksherim zebet tzadzeh, and one of them is arboim ksherim, which means they were originally ksherim. And ve'inam mayim ashuvim pesel mikvah sheyesh ba'arboim sok mishbiyana, because since it became a kosher mikvah, like we mentioned that it becomes kosher before it becomes pasul, so mele the 2 joined and they both became arboim so before the third had a chance to pasul anything. Mele it's a kosher mikvah. That's talking about if the shov nasad. However, hoya shov be'emtza, if the one that was pasul was be'emtza, the mayim shuvim was be'emtza, and v'yardu v'tovelu be'em, and then they went in, they were table. And v'nermu hamayim v'nisarvu ha-mikvois is that a mikvois kshahoyot. You don't have 40 saw because they didn't join. They joined through a mikvah which was considered pasul. And really, Nachmer, the Rambam says mikvois kshahoyot, but l'chura the mikvois are not kshahoyot because lepel the mikvah each one had 3 saw, 3 lugim of mayim psulim, and v'atevim tmeim kshahoyot. Sharei le'nisarvu arboim saw maksherim. The arboim soy maksherim never became morav. L'fisha einam b'tzadzeh shahashov mavdul b'neim. So be'emes is tzorich bir because lepel the Rambam writes again hari mikvois kshahoyu. L'chura the pashtus would be that the mikvois became pasul because since you had the one in the middle which was shuvim and it flowed over from the shuvim into this mikveh and it flowed over from the shuvim into this mikveh. So memela, so they became pasul. Unless you'll say that the mikvahs were completely filled. They were completely filled, and therefore, even though they flowed over, but lapel, since it flows back, so mele is not considered that shleisha lugim fell in. I'll call upon him. In the case of when the 2 were next to each other, so they became a kosher mikveh, And Memela, so there's no problem of the Maim Shuvim that was overflowing. Mashenkin over here, they never became a kosher mikveh because Lepil, they didn't touch each other. The Rambam doesn't say that they become puzzle. The Rambam's fakir, he says, the Pashtus would be that they became puzzle. Sorach bir.